Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool with nathancoolphoto.com, and in this tutorial I want to show you how you can shoot and then edit a very large room like this. Now this is something that wasn't done with lights, it also wasn't done with HDR, and there's some times where you have to get in and out of a large room. In this case it was some amenities at a condo complex. I run across this all the time where you might have a very short window when there's nobody inside there and you just don't have an hour or two to go through and light it all. Now if it was for an architectural shoot, we would have already made some plans, the place would have been empty, it would have been off limits, and so we could go in there and set up a bunch of lights and do a lot of other stuff with it. But with this case, I only had just a few minutes to grab the shot. It happens quite a bit, but you can do this without using lights, without using also HDR, and you can get some really good effects out of it. So I want to step you through that process and how to do this and how to then shoot and edit a very large room. You want to see how this is done? Let's get started. So this is the room. I've got it here in Lightroom, and you can see what I've done is taken a lot of footage. You see down here on the film strip there's a whole lot of different pictures, different frames down here. Now if this were, like I said, an architectural shoot, this would be a whole lot different. But one of the things you might recall from my book on the shot list for real estate photography, is that when you shoot amenities, sometimes it's best to take a little bit of extra time, whether you're on site, processing, or both, because you can reuse these pictures. So this process is not necessarily quick and simple, but it is something that can get you some really good results, and then you can judge whether it will be viable enough for possible resale on other subsequent shoots. Anyways, let's see how this is done from the technical perspective. So I've taken a lot of different frames. So the idea here is to take a whole bunch of exposures and use the an automatic white balance. So you just use your white balance in the auto mode. But I like to use, for these cases, since I'm not going to be using flash, I'm not really then worried about stressing my flashes and trying to get enough light and worried about cast and all those other issues I talk about in other videos and throughout my books. I'm just going to use ISO 100, get the best quality I possibly can, and I'm going to use f8. And out of this, once again, it's auto white balanced. I'm racking this out to about 16 millimeters on that Tacchina lens I love to use, the f2.8 16 to 28. And I started out with some really high stuff. Now I like to start out with about an 1/8 of a second. That's where this is. I went even a little bit brighter on that at some point, but I've got that 1/8 of a second. I start working myself down. This is a 15th of a second. You can see here though where I went brighter is a 1/4. That was way too much, too bright for what I needed, but I'm gathering as much footage as I can. I'm actually shooting in brackets, and I keep changing my shutter speed, shooting more brackets. And what I selected out of here, the ones that I've flagged, I've got one that's fairly bright. This looks good. You can also see here on the histogram, I'm very far right of center. Now I want something in the middle, and that's kind of where I am here. And once again, like I talk about in the books and other videos, center to right of center gets me a pretty even exposure. So I'm going to use this as my base. I'm going to use this to brighten some other areas. I need something darker though. So this frame right here had some fairly dark areas, not too bad. And when I get down into here, I've even got some more darker areas, but I don't have those windows yet. Now, I can't do the darken mode window pull, but I still need to get that view outside, so I make sure that I expose just for that. And by the time I'm down here, this was at ISO 100, f8, and 1/80th of a second, and that was enough during this winter time to get a decent exposure of the outside through those windows. I even went darker in some cases. This was at 1/160th of a second. That's just a little bit too dark for what you'd expect to see through the windows naturally. So anyways, just like any other editing that we would do, excuse me, whether this was a flash ambient blended or otherwise, I'm going to select all those layers, and I'm going to go edit in and then open as layers in Photoshop. So once again, this will then create a stack in Photoshop of all these various layers. So it's loading those up, and you can see here I've got one I've already done. So I've got a head start, so we don't have to go through every single bit of editing for us. I'm going to show you the basics and then go to that other file, that Photoshop file, and then wrap this up. Once again, this is a time-consuming process. This isn't something you would do for every single MLS type of shoot. You might be able to do this for some architectural stuff since it does take some time. But once again, the idea here is, even though this is just for like a condominium complex, that you can resell these photos, so it's worthwhile to put in the time to do this. So viability aside, I'll let you make that decision. Let's get started. So we've got these all loaded up. First thing I want to do, since there were so many shots taken, make sure we've got them aligned. I've got an action, you've seen me do this to auto align, but I'm going to select all those layers, and then I'm going to go up to edit, and then auto align those layers. Just do it as auto, and that makes sure, now without having to move the camera too much, they're probably going to be aligned, but I want to really make sure that they are. So that took care of it. Doesn't look like they were too bad. So this guy, he's my bright layer. He's not going to be my base. So just to keep track of him, I'm going to call him bright, and then I'm going to add a layer mask and hide all. Now this right here looks to be about my medium exposure, so I'll just call him medium, and I'm actually going to then drag him down to the bottom and keep him as my base layer. Now this one's a dark one, so I'm going to call him dark, and then layer mask hide. And this one's even darker, so I'm going to call him even darker, and then layer mask hide. Now let's begin. The process is to first start filling in some of the shadows. I've got a pretty good base layer from that medium layer down here. So that's filling in a lot of this stuff. It's not too bad, and from it then I can add in bright. Now if I was just using luminosity mode on a flash, I wouldn't be very happy with trying to fill in those dark areas. But everything's in normal mode. Everything's normal blending. So as you've seen me do on other videos where I do exposure blending, make this quick enough, I'm going to grab the quick selection tool, and that was up here. I just hit W to get that. And I'm going to select this really dark area here, and I'm going to start with that. So that's pretty good. I don't necessarily have to get this whole wall, so I'll just knock out some of that and just get an area where I know I don't have to try to brush it in. It's going to fill all that. Revert the colors by hitting X and then press the delete key. That does the opposite of what you think when your colors are reversed. Unselect that with Control D, put my colors back, X. Now what I can do is use a brush and start feathering in some of that. So I'm just painting. You see my brush is at a 30% flow. So now I'm able to paint some of this stuff in, but I know that I got that entire area. And that was the whole idea here behind me using that quick selection tool. I want to make sure that that whole hallway back here, and you can see there's a racquetball court back in there. Going back and forth to see where you are, you use Control and then click. You can see where you want to add maybe some more, so you can add in maybe some more over here. So the process is the same for all the other layers that we want to blend in. I know we need a lot down here, for instance, on this, maybe fill in some more down here, but we've got some areas that we really need to fill in some darker stuff. So let's see where we are if we add some dark. I'm going to do Shift click, and I can see that maybe we want to darken up a few things like around the window here, so I'll add some of that. That's fine, but I've got a really big hot spot right in there. And this is where I might have to go with that even darker exposure. If I see what that's looking like by selecting darker and doing a Shift click, I can see that would be pretty good. So once again, just like on all my other exposure blending stuff, grab the quick selection tool, and it knows pretty well then to where shadows and the luminosity areas are. So I'm just going to select around that, make sure that I get it all, and then revert my colors with X, hit delete, and it fills that in. Hit X to revert it back and deselect it. Now this is where I might have to then do some feathering, like erasing stuff. I've got the eraser tool, just erasing so we didn't have that harsh line there. Now I can take just the darker exposure above it and maybe fill in and help feather like this corner here, where there was just a little bit too much. So I can zoom out, see where I am. There's a lot down here on the floor. We'll take that darker, and we can do that. We can brush it in, or I could even take once again the quick selection tool and select that bright area, revert colors with X, hit the delete key, and that fills it in. Then it's just a matter of then feathering all that in. So that's how the process is done to then blend some of this stuff together. I don't have to go through the whole thing to show you how that's done, but before I get to the windows, one other thing you can do before you get into Lightroom is you can lighten that up. So for instance, back here where this racquetball court is, that hallway still looks too dark. So I'm going to go to my bright layer above it. I'm going to go Layer, Adjustment Layer, Brightness and Contrast. Now what I'm going to do is also add a clipping mask to that with this little doodad here. That's going to make sure that it only applies to that layer that I called bright. Now I'm going to up that brightness, and it did go to other areas, but I wanted to make sure that it only applied to that, and it helps me then feather it out on the next step. So I revert the colors on this by hitting Control I. Now it's a hide all mask. And now I can brush in where I want that. And I'm overlapping, you can see here my brush is overlapping, but I'm not so worried about that overlap because once again it's a clipping mask. I know that I'm not going to go into some of those darker areas. Then I can go back here to this adjustment and figure out how bright I'd like that to be. Then just adjusting some of the feathering off that. Like I said, this is a bit of a time-consuming process to get this all done. That's why you wouldn't do this for every single MLS shoot. It just wouldn't be worth it. But when it is worth it, then it really does come in handy. Now let's move on to our windows. So my window layer was down here at the bottom, moving them all the way up to the top. So this becomes the tricky part. Now there's no window pull, so you really just have no other alternative but to cut out these windows. So layer mask hide on this guy. Now the easy part with these windows is that the frame and the divisions are black. So I can just take a quick selection tool and pretty much get all the way around that window, all that I need to, right? And that's fine. So I'm grabbing, you can see it's even grabbing some of the pot, and we'll deal with that here in just a second. If you need to deselect stuff, you use the Alt and hold down the as you're selecting. That just does the opposite, it unselects. So you can do that, get to where you think you've got that good selection going on, and we can fine tune that here with a number of different ways. But let's say that's good, revert to colors with X and press the delete key. Boom, there we are. You can see there's still some artifact stuff going around here. So this is where you have to edit some of that out. In this case, I'll use a polygon tool. You just go ahead and draw a polygon like here. It makes it easier to hit a straight line. Press the delete key. That's done. Just try to get the pot. I'll use the quick selection tool on the pot itself. Little tip on doing that too. When you're using the quick selection tool and you're on a mask, it's really gathering just about everything else around it. So get down here to a layer that might have some definition like bright, and that might make it a little easier. In this case it really didn't. But once again, we'll just select that area as much as we can around that pot, and then we just go ahead and hit the delete key up on the mask for that window, and that gets rid of that. And you can start feathering some of that in a little bit better. It gets a little bit tricky, and the same thing then would be applied to each window. So once again though, I've already done a lot of that work, and that's in this file. So here's all the layers that I was working with. You can see pretty much the same. I had my medium as base, I used dark and darker, and then I also had my bright layer with a brightness layer, adjustment layer with a clipping mask for the bright. And then my windows, so without it and then with it. You can see me go back and forth. You can see where I've done that in here. Now, if you look really close, you can see the windows mask has some differences on it. And that's because if I were to just paint in, let's take this guy back here for instance. If I were to go ahead and cut in a whole bunch of this window, it's going to look abnormal. I don't want all of it. So what you would do in this case is you're going to use an eraser tool. So after you get some of that you've cut out, you can see that's too dark. So you take an eraser tool at about, in this case I'll use 20% flow, and you erase some of that out of there. And that then blends that window in better. So that's what I did here on this layer. And that's what I did also up here on the top right for that window. Another step I did was to lighten up the ceiling a little bit. And that you've seen me do in other videos for the color cast, and I'll just do it again for you real quick. I'll turn that layer off, and that's just going with a polygon tool, and you just kind of roughly draw around the ceiling. It doesn't have to be accurate. In fact, you can see I can't be accurate around here unless I really start using quick selection or some type of pen tool or maybe the magnetic lasso to get around these corners, but I'm not that worried about it. The ceiling itself is white enough. I just want to add a little bit of extra whiteness to it, so I'm not too worried about these little idiosyncrasies of being just slightly off. Draw that around there, and then you would just go to select it and modify a little bit. So select, and then we'd modify, and then feather that by, let's say about 5 pixels. And then you would go to layer, and then you have an adjustment layer, and that would be your hue saturation layer, like that, and then down your your saturation. Boom, there we have it. If you want to lighten the ceiling, you can hit that little lighten area there. Now I've got a nice light, bright white ceiling. Now, we've also got some areas up here that we might want to fix. What do? Select all your layers now first. Do Control-J to duplicate all of them. Right-click on those, and merge them together. Now you have one layer that you can edit with. These other ones aren't even being seen down here. So you can zoom in here, and now you can take that whole thing and decide, okay, am I just going to use a spot brush on here to try to fix some of that? Do I have to do a clone tool? The spot brush seems to be working just fine on that, so that would be all that we would need. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with it. There's a lot of other stuff we could possibly do, but let's say that's good. We just hit Control S to save that. That's going to take it back then into Lightroom. That's where we can then add the final adjustments to it. All those special bumps that we might want to do. Might even be able to change the white balance a little bit. Still a little bit on the warm side, even though I did use a gray card in some shots to see where I was, and it was pretty accurate for where it should be. And some of those gray card shots too, you can see if you've never seen this done before. So earlier in the game when I'm doing a whole bunch of these other shots, I'm shooting the room from another angle, and you can see here I'm holding that gray card. I did it on a bracket, so I've got it in all my exposures. And all that you would do is you would go in here and then of course use the eyedropper here for the white balance, hit it, and it was pretty close. You can see the changes that were done here, and those would then be the changes I would use throughout. But anyways, the save should be done on that. It's still saving here. It's big. That's done now. Good. So now we'll get back to where that file was here. Let me find it. It should have automatically shown up in Photoshop, but of course, since I was running around editing a bunch of stuff, it didn't show up right away. So that file is here. Okay, now that we have this shot back into Lightroom, let's go ahead and apply some bumps to it. And this is where we can start correcting geometry if we need to and all that. So I'll just typically add my light bump to here. We'll maybe cool it down just a tad like that. Maybe up the whites a little bit, get some brightness in there. Might be able to then correct a little bit of geometry. We got just a little bit of distortion going on here, so maybe a little bit of that. I'm going the wrong direction, so maybe just a little bit of that. I think the rotation's probably good. Crop it down where we need to, and then that looks pretty good. So once then we go ahead and export the picture, our final product looks like this. Now, as you can see, that's a very time-consuming process to go through. You would not want to do this if you didn't have any type of recompensation for taking that much time to do it. But once again, one of the things I talk about in shot lists is that, you know, these amenity shots are used over and over and over again. A complex like this, one reason why they have such great amenities is that it costs quite a bit for the HOA, and they have hundreds of those units in there, and they come up for sale all the time. And who gets the gigs? Well, my clients do, and I go back there and I shoot it. So when I have a chance to get those good amenities, I know that they're going to be resold on other shoots, so it definitely is worth the time to do it. Could I have gotten sharper pictures if I used lights? Definitely so. Could I have done that in enough time that would have allowed me to do it for this type of shoot? Not at all. Now, if I was shooting for designer once again, we would have set aside the time, and we might have even had more than one person there, and we could definitely light it and do a lot more with it. Anyways, I hope this tutorial was useful for you and that you can use some of this in your photography as well. If you did like this video, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost you anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.